This training series is brought to you by a generous grant from Impact 100 and Autism Pensacola.
There's a place I like to go to from time to time to feel carefree, like a child again. It's the playground. It's a place where I can sit and reflect and focus on what's important to me and my family. The program you are about to watch can help you focus and understand the Individualized Education Program, or the IEP process, for your student. The more you know and learn about your child through evaluation, measurement, and monitoring techniques, the better you will understand your child's needs and your rights as a parent. Join me now as we understand the IEP process. Good evening. My name is Amy Lorton, and I work with Autism Pensacola, and I wear many hats at Autism Pensacola. I serve as a consultant for special needs education and working with parents who have concerns about their child's IEP, working with their school team. And also I serve a role there as executive assistant to the CEO. Also work as office manager and also teach this class. So I have several different roles there at Autism Pensacola. And I'm very happy to present to you this information. Tonight we're going to talk all about IEPs, the process of getting one started, the process of monitoring one, and the process of going all through it again with reevaluation. So tonight we're going to take a look at the overview really quickly. And there's 10 steps to this IEP process. And I've listed them out here on the slide, and you can follow along in your pamphlet. The 10 steps are that the student is identified as needing services and or related services in the school system beyond what is provided already in the general ed curriculum or in the setting. Parent signs consent and the student is evaluated. That's the second step. Third step is that eligibility for services is determined. The fourth step is that the student is found eligible or ineligible for services. Then step 5 is the IEP meeting is scheduled, and if you're here, most of you have already experienced that. And then the 6th step is that the IEP is actually written by the team. Step 7 is services are provided to the student. Step 8 is progress is measured over time. 9, IEP is reviewed, and 10, student is reevaluated, and it starts all over again. For those of you who are very visual and you're thinking like I am, I've provided a couple of flow charts for you to look at and diagrams. This is the process. It starts with the evaluation, the meeting, the design, the implementation, all the way back again to a new evaluation. For those of you who are linear thinkers, we've got the flow chart here with your arrows, and that's just for your information to look at later. Let's talk about the basics of IDEA. What is IDEA? You've probably heard this term thrown out there at your meetings, but we want to get down to the basics. What, in layman's terms, is IDEA? It is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act of 1975, and in 2004 it was revised with some really positive revisions, in my opinion, to be called the 2004 Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, or IDEA 2004. So if you hear the term IDEA 2004, that's what that means. That's the name of the law, and that just refers to the fact that we've got a revised law on the books now. Basically, IDEA protects your child's right to a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment according to your child's individual needs. Now that's a mouthful. And within that mouthful, you might notice some of the words are capitalized. You might have heard the term FAPE. FAPE stands for Free and Appropriate Public Education, which your child is entitled to if they have a disability. And you might have heard of LRE. That's where this is, the least restrictive environment. That means the law protects your child's right to be in an environment as much as possible with typical students in the school day according to their individual needs. So that's IDEA in a nutshell. Let's talk about the first step of developing an IEP. The first step is that the student is identified as needing services. Now, this begins with a referral for services, typically to a study team at the school level. Now, that could mean a teacher has noticed some things in the classroom and has made a referral to the counselor or to the ESC teacher. It could be a parent coming to the school saying, I would really like for you to take a look at some of our concerns, some of my child's needs. It could be the PE teacher, it could be the school counselor, it could be a staff member in the school system. Basically, it can be submitted by anyone who recognizes the student has a disability or a need for additional supports and services outside of what is provided in the general ed curriculum. The study is typically conducted by a teacher who has identified that the student is struggling in class and could benefit from additional supports and services. And that's just usually because that's the person working with your child most directly. That's considered a referral. Now, some of you have been hearing the term probably the RTI, or response to intervention. RTI and IEPs aren't the same thing, and they're not designed to really go together. RTI is designed for students whose interventions are not required and that fit the criteria for a disability. In other words, like if you have a student that can benefit from supports in the gen ed setting that are already provided in the gen ed setting, then RTI is very appropriate for them. And I broke it down here for you to kind of get an idea of what the criteria is. And general education interventions are not required prior to a referral for students with disabilities such as speech disorders, severe cognitive impairments, physical or sensory disorders, or severe social behavior deficits. If your student has any of these 4 areas of need, they skip RTI and they go straight to an IEP evaluation. If they don't have any of these needs, then they go through the RTI process of evaluation and trying to find some supports and interventions in the gen ed setting for that child. How many of you experienced RTI evaluations so far? Okay, good. Well, then I will kind of breeze through this a little bit because it may not apply to you. General education interventions are required prior to a referral for all other students, though. Students that don't meet these 4 criteria here. And evaluations and interventions may occur simultaneously. I have parents that come to me and say, my child is going through RTI evaluations and an IEP evaluation. Is that okay? And I say yes, because they're trying to determine if your child is eligible for services under an IEP and or if they're eligible for services in the gen ed setting, because there may be some both going on if they're gen ed placement and ESC placement. So they're just trying to gain an understanding of what the needs are for your student. Step 2, the student is evaluated. Now, if your child has an IEP, they went through an evaluation process, sometimes referred to as a global evaluation if it's their first evaluation. The official term is an initial evaluation. And prior to conducting a student's initial evaluation, the school must do these things. They must provide the parent with prior written notice. That basically means they're going to give you a piece of paper to say, we plan to assess your child, evaluate your child, and we're planning on starting it at this time. And then they're going to want to get your consent. And consent is basically just a signature saying, yes, I agree to you beginning evaluation for my child. They're going to also provide you a safeguards notice. What that means in layman's terms is a copy of your rights. And your rights under IDEA and also your state rights as well for your child's services and evaluation. How many of you gotten a what they call procedural safeguards pamphlet at the beginning of every IEP meeting? I hope you do get that because you're supposed to get it at the beginning of every IEP meeting. I have enough to wallpaper a room, but if you've never read it, please do. It's great information for you as a parent, and I would encourage you to read every bit of it. It's good, important information to have. The initial evaluation and consent process. The initial evaluation is a way of collecting information about your students' needs, about their academic performance, and their strengths and weaknesses and interests. All those things are important. On an IEP, if you've noticed, if you've looked at it, there's 5 domains, and each domain represents a part of your child's learning experience and developmental experience, and that's why they're trying to collect all this information in all these areas, not just academic. This evaluation process is used to help determine whether a student has a disability and is eligible for services in the school district. And no determination can be made until all the evaluations are completed and reviewed with you. Prior to an initial evaluation taking place, the school must obtain your written consent for the evaluation. Now here's the basics for you guys and another visual to make it easier to understand the process of getting the information, how they're processing it, and going forward with the evaluation. You're going to have the need identified, respond to the need, measure the results, and report the progress back to you. And that's basically the whole loop of an IEP, the purpose of an IEP. What's important for you to know as a caregiver or a parent helping to monitor your student's plan is that it's extremely important to effectively communicate your child's needs to your school team before the evaluation takes place. You are your child's expert. You know your child's strengths and weaknesses, areas of need, and you have concerns, and you've probably been with that child from birth, and so those are the type of needs and observed behaviors, if you will, that are important for the school team to be aware of in helping them make an accurate assessment of your child's needs. So don't be afraid to speak up and share that at the beginning of the evaluation process. Initial evaluations in IDEA 2004. Here's what the law has to say about the timeline on the evaluations. They have a specific time frame listed in Section 300 of the law which mandates how long they have to finish an evaluation on your child. And this is what it says: that the initial evaluation must be conducted within 60 days of receiving parental consent for the evaluation, or if the state establishes a time frame within which the evaluation must be conducted within that time frame. Well, it just so happens that the state of Florida also has a 60-day time frame. So it mirrors the federal time frame. So as soon as you put ink to paper on your consent form, they have 60 days to complete that child's evaluations completely. And then you will have your scheduled meeting and discuss the results. So when parents ask me this question a lot, they say, well, how long before my evaluation is completed? They have 60 days. But from the time that you sign consent, not from when they start the evaluation. This includes the pre-referral activities, the receipt of referral for evaluation, the receipt of parent consent for evaluation. All that's included in there. Frequently asked questions on evaluations. I get this all the time, so I thought I'd share some of these with you. First question is, can the school refuse to evaluate a student? The short answer is yes. And the long answer is this: in keeping with the provisions in IDEA, a school district may refuse to evaluate a child. However, they must provide you with a written notice of why, explaining why the school refuses to conduct the initial evaluation and the information that was used to make that decision. In other words, they're going to give you their rationale for why they did not. A parent can challenge this refusal by requesting a due process hearing, though. Usually the rationale of the school is going to be very thorough. It's going to have some of their own informal testing maybe in there. But yes, you have the right to appeal, if you will, their refusal. The other question I get a lot is, what does an evaluation tell me as a parent? Well, the goal of an evaluation is to identify the student's present areas of strengths and weaknesses. Evaluations should attempt to address the following things: what learning needs does the student have? Does the student have a disability? What does the student do well? And what does the student know or not know? How does the student learn best? And what behavioral needs does the student have? All those areas are what's going to be looked at in the evaluation process. All right, let's talk a moment about the educational diagnosis versus the medical diagnosis on your child's IEP. I get this question a lot. On the front page of your IEP, it usually has listed on there area of need, and it's listed either as language impaired or autism or OHI or developmental disorder, whatever's on your child's IEP. That is what's considered a program name or a educational diagnosis, as some people call it. The difference between an educational diagnosis and a medical diagnosis is in how they treat your child's diagnosis, medically or educationally. The two aren't the same. And this is where a lot of parents ask me questions. They say, well, my child has autism, but it's not on their IEP. Well, they may not have been identified by the school system as him having autism. And the difference is, it's important to understand that the school professionals will not diagnose your child with a medical disability. They will look at your child in terms of how do these needs affect their learning at school or their whole learning environment. So schools are only required by IDEA to identify your student's needs in relation to his ability to benefit from the general education curriculum. That's it. This is sometimes referred to as the educational diagnosis. Again, formally it's known as the program. So I think it's important for us to understand that they're not going to go beyond what they're going to recognize the needs are of the student in relationship to the general education setting. So that's where the difference is. Now there are some exceptions when, let's say, a child is tube fed, has a clinic plan. That's going to kind of be implemented into their IEP because that's a service that they need while they're at school to function and learn. So that's a little bit different, but as far as a medical diagnosis, they're only concerned with how their behavior and their needs affect their learning at school. More on evaluations. The evaluation must gather relevant, functional, developmental, and academic information about the student, including information provided by you. So you are a very important part of this whole process. It's your responsibility to help provide some information to the team that's going to be evaluating your child. That way we can get a full picture of your child's needs. Parents are expected to be included in this process according to IDEA, and the school should be asking you some questions to help gather that information. And remember, you're the expert on your child. Take advantage of that opportunity. Now, more than one evaluation will be completed on your student typically. I can't tell you that a number that is supposed to be given on your student because every student's different. But typically what you'll see is some form of psychoed eval, maybe a speech and language evaluation, some sort of benchmark testing to determine academic performance and level. Maybe an OT or a PT or an AT test, which is assistive technology, physical therapy, occupational therapy. Whatever your child presents as a need, they're going to try to find a measurement or an assessment tool to help determine the level of need for that student. So you may have 2 assessments on your student, you may have 30. It just really depends on your particular student's needs. Now, many school personnel may be involved in evaluating your child. You may have the school psychologist, you may have the speech-language pathologist, you may have the teacher, the gen ed teacher, you may have an ESC teacher, you could have a social worker, an audiologist, an occupational therapist. There could be a whole large team of people involved in evaluating your child, or it could just be 1 or 2 people. Now, after the evaluation, then what? Well, a formal report will be drafted, and each person that evaluated your child will give a piece of that report. Whatever measurement that they did on your child, they will report back to you. And this will be drafted in writing and provided to you at no charge, which is wonderful to have all this information and not to have had to pay thousands of dollars privately to get it done. Then the team will schedule a meeting to review the results of the evaluation with you and to determine if the student is eligible or not eligible for ESE services. Now, this type of meeting is usually referred to as the eligibility staffing meeting, commonly known as the eligibility meeting or the evaluation meeting. But technically it's called the eligibility staffing. So there's all these terms, this alphabet soup, all these unusual, unfamiliar terms that we have to learn as parents who have students with special needs. Now, the parents should be diligent about reading the results of this evaluation prior to meeting with the team. Hopefully, they will provide you your written report before the meeting. I understand that doesn't always happen, that you don't get your report until the meeting, and usually it's explained to the parent this way. Well, we didn't want you to be confused about what you were reading, and we were wanting to have the opportunity to explain it to you all together, sitting together. It is sometimes very overwhelming to read an eligibility report, but they're supposed to provide it to you prior to your meeting. That way, if you have questions or concerns, you can bring them at the ready to the meeting. Now, I need to kind of talk a little bit about the private school situation because it does factor in a little bit to IDEA. And I know we've had parents in this class before that have had private school students that are thinking about going back into the school system or going into the school system initially. And then there's some that are thinking about pulling out and wondering how services will be delivered and that type of thing. So just a few facts I wanted to give you about private schools. School districts are responsible for evaluating all students suspected of having a disability. And most child find activities are conducted through the Florida Diagnostic Learning and Resource Center. Most of you are familiar with this agency, called FIDLERS for short. And then homeschooled students can be evaluated in the same way, even though the state of Florida does not consider homeschooling to be private schooling. That's an interesting fact a lot of people don't know. If a parent of an identified student who attends a nonprofit private school wishes for him to be considered for services from the school district, that school must notify the district in which the private school is located of the student's needs to offer the opportunity to be evaluated. In other words, the school district is not required to provide any services for that student, but must consider him for federal dollars that they must spend on a student with disabilities in a non-profit private school. That's a lot to take in, but I wanted to share a few of those facts with you in case you weren't aware. And now we're going on to step 3 of the evaluation process. This is the largest part of your IEP process as far as from the very beginning, is this whole evaluation eligibility process. So now we've gotten through the staffing meeting. Let's say we're ready to determine if the student's eligible or not. This is our step 3. Under IDEA, the responsibility of determining eligibility is tasked to a group of qualified professionals and the parent. That's important to know because all those people that signed their name to that long staffing meeting notice and gave you all those reports, they're going to now be partnering with you, and you are now a team. You've heard of the IEP team. Now you have an IEP team. If it's been determined that your student qualifies for services, and now you're a part of giving your input to that team. The district will determine what constitutes a qualified professional, though. And I get this question a lot because they're like, well, you know, I don't know if that person's really qualified to evaluate my child or give me an assessment on my child. Well, it's up to the district to determine who that is and what are the qualifiers for that person or the qualifications if they're considered acceptable or not. Now, this group of qualified professionals may or may not be made up of the same individuals who were involved in evaluating the student. And if you've been to IEP meetings where you have a gen ed teacher, for instance, come and attend your meeting, it may not be the gen ed teacher that was at the last meeting. That's okay. That's within the range of the law. Same here. As long as they have a representative of that area of service at your meeting who can explain the results to you, then that's perfectly well within the law to do that. Just don't be surprised if you don't see the same person at the first meeting you do at the second meeting. The staffing committee is required to follow the Florida State Board of Education rules to determine eligibility for the student. If you want to find that out, you can go online, and there's a list that they follow, criteria for determining eligibility. And I won't get into that now. It's very dry and long, but they do have to follow a set of standards to determine eligibility. At that point, the committee must provide a comprehensive rationale using all of the information gathered, including the information you provided them, in order to determine eligibility. So step 4 is actually stating whether they think the student is eligible or ineligible for services. And once the team determines that a student is eligible for ESE services, they provide the parent with written notice of that fact. So you will get what's called an eligibility notice, which if you look back in all the years that gone by, the first time you had an initial evaluation, you'll find a piece of paper that says eligibility notice, and it probably has your signature and a few other people's signatures on there. After which, that time the team will schedule with you a meeting to develop the IEP. Now, for those of you who don't know already, IEP stands for Individualized Education Program. It doesn't stand for Individualized Education Plan, which I hear a lot. It's program. This must be done within 30 days of the student's eligibility to determination date. In other words, the date that they say, okay, we've determined your student is eligible for services, they have 30 days to schedule this meeting to start developing a program, a written program for your student. Now, if your child or student is eligible for services, by law, the IEP must address your student's educational needs, regardless of what program and or related service he is determined to be eligible for. In other words, they have to write a program for your child. If the team determined that your student is not eligible for services, however, the district is obligated to utilize general education remediation strategies and procedures that would be provided to any student. And again, they might go through the RTI process. They might put them in Read 180 or Title I or whatever program they've got going on that would be available to a typical or gen ed student. They would start looking at interventions and strategies to implement for your student in the gen ed setting. But they would have to give you a written rationale for why they wouldn't be eligible for special needs services. Step 5 is the IEP meeting. Now, following the eligibility report for a student determined eligible for ESE services, a meeting will be scheduled within that 30-day period, like we talked about, to develop the written part of your student's program, also known as the IEP. The school must schedule the meeting at a time that is convenient for you. And you can video conference with this meeting. You can phone conference this meeting. Most parents feel like they don't have a say in when this meeting is scheduled, and that's a source of frustration for many parents, but IDEA is very clear on that. It must be at a time that is convenient for the caregiver or the parent. And what I recommend to families is that when you go to your eligibility meeting, your staffing meeting, come with a list of dates and times that you are free to meet with them for your IEP meeting. That way you can make sure that it's going to be a time that suits you and you already got it on the calendar before you walk out of the room. The parent will receive then a written notice of meeting from the school for the IEP meeting, which lists the persons or the areas, subject areas, who will attend the meeting. The parent should sign this and return it to the school within 10 days. And that will be a list for you to know what all service areas, staffers who are going to be there. It will have to include an administrator, if your child's going to be receiving ESE services, an ESE representative, and then it will also include a gen ed teacher if your student's determined to need gen ed setting at any point in the day. And it may include other staff people such as a speech language pathologist, occupational therapist, whoever, audiologist, whoever else is going to be helping to develop your student's program. Now, if a parent wishes to audio and or video record the meeting, you have the right to do that, but you must provide prior written notice to the team that you will be doing that. The best way of doing that is to respond on the form that they give you, the meeting notice. Sign your name, date it, and then say, note, please note, I will plan to record this meeting. And I would say audio record, video record, be specific about it. And, for my note-taking purposes or something to that nature. That way you've provided prior written notice, and it's all on one sheet of paper. But you must do that, otherwise they can refuse you if they didn't get prior written notice. And another note about that, if you're going to be recording the meeting, they must record the meeting as well with their own equipment. So don't be offended by that if you see that happen. They must do it by law. So, and it's not an adversarial thing, it's just to be consistent and fair. And step 5 is all about the IEP meeting. I love this slide because at the top left you see a student sharing in their own IEP meeting, advocating for themselves, sharing a little bit about them. I don't know if you can see it on this slide, but it says, a little about myself, and the first little blurb there says, I'm 15 years old, and he's standing there presenting. That's great. Your student doesn't have to do that. You don't have to do that. But it's such a nice visual reminder that this is what we're here for in this meeting, is for the student. And if the student can, yeah, right. So if appropriate, the student may attend the IEP meeting. It's all about them anyway. It's team, insert the name. And they can participate in the development of the IEP too. If they have input that they want to share about how they learn most appropriately in the environment, they can share those facts. If they say, well, I really have a hard time with loud noises, maybe I do good with some headphones. These are the kind of things that a student can participate in their meeting. Or just sit and listen. Just the fact that they're there speaks volumes. Now, I realize it's not necessarily appropriate either because of their age or their ability or whatever their needs are. It may not be appropriate in your mind for that student to attend, and that's perfectly fine. But it's strongly encouraged when they get to be about age 12, because that's the age of transition for a student. And if it's appropriate for them to attend, it's oftentimes a good idea. Now, I'll say a word about this because IEP meetings can be long and drawn out and very dry. And sometimes we're talking about things that we might not want our student to necessarily hear. So if you want your student to be a part of your meeting, but not necessarily all of your meeting, think about a time where maybe a staffer can leave the room, go get your student, bring them in for a period of time, let them go back to class. But just kind of be thinking about ways you can get your student involved. A lot of parents bring with them a piece of paper, not necessarily their student, with what's called a student agenda. And we'll talk more about that in the next 2 weeks, of things that their student would like to see happen in their own education plan or program. Now, a note about this. The school is obligated to develop the IEP for your student whether you elect to participate or not in your student's plan or your student's team. IDEA is very clear about this. If your student has been identified as having a need and needs to have an individualized education program, and you choose not to participate in developing one, they're obligated to develop one for your child, without you even. So I strongly encourage parents to be involved in that whole process. because you want to give your input. You're the expert on your child. Please participate in that process. Step 6, the IEP is drafted. And when we talk about the IEP, we're talking about the written program, what you get at the end of your meeting in print. So at the meeting, the team will consider the following in developing and drafting the IEP document. They'll consider the present levels of performance for your student, also known as the plop. And I mentioned before, there's a lot of alphabet soup we have to swim through and learn, all these acronyms and terms, and plop is one of them, the present levels of performance. That seeks to identify where the student is currently functioning. And then it assesses the strengths and weaknesses of the student across all of those 5 domains we talked about earlier, not just educational or academic, I should say, but social, emotional, communication, independent living skills. All of those areas are considered because that's all part of learning. It will also include the concerns of the parent. There will be a portion of the meeting where they'll say, hey, mom and dad or grandma or granddad, what would you like to see in your student's program? Do you have any concerns? Do you have any questions? They'll record that in the IEP, and that's a great time to speak up. It should also include the results of the evaluations from the initial evaluation or the re-eval, any type of district or state assessments, FCAT, which is going away this year, but whatever they have going on statewide, and other measurements such as classroom examples or quizzes or tests or end of course exams. Those are coming for a lot of you who are in middle school, high school, or your students are. Then it should also include measurable goals, objectives, and benchmarks. And then it also should include how progress towards the goals will be measured, such as quarterly or every 9 weeks or midpoint in 9 weeks. However they're going to measure it, it should state that in the IEP. Then it should also state what supplemental aids and services are being offered to the student according to their needs. All right, we're still on step 6, which is drafting the IEP. Individual needs of the student, such as special transportation, extended school year and assistive technology, speech and communication, language supports for a student who has limited English proficiency, and positive behavior intervention plans or other positive behavioral supports, deaf or blind services, and many others are also considered and need to be included in the IEP if determined appropriate for that student. Now, at a certain age, your child will begin to have transition services listed in the IEP as well. And to kind of list out what transition services mean, because some of you have younger kids, that includes diploma options. Or is your student going for a standard diploma? It's going for alternate diploma. Students' desired post-school outcomes should be listed on the IEP. The transfer of rights from minor to adulthood. And also any kind of agency linkage that would be appropriate for your child. ADP, we've got vocational rehab, we got a lot of things we can put on there. Some sort of service that will be transitioning into from school at some point after the school is done with their obligation to your student. Then we talk about placement, and that should be on the IEP as well. Placement is determined based on needs considered and supported in the IEP. So at the very end of the IEP process or meeting, that's when you determine placement. Unfortunately, I see in a lot of meetings that I attend, placement's discussed first, and then all this other stuff's developed. That's the cart before the horse. You can't determine placement until you've discussed need. You can't discuss placement until you've determined how you're going to meet those needs, how you're going to measure those needs, how you're going to support those needs. Then you determine placement.